So welcome everybody to today's Geoscience in Context panel discussion on the green transition in natural resources. So my name's Sam Wimperney and I'll be chairing the discussion today. And we're also joined by our panel members, Pippa Howard from Fauna and Flora International and Andy Whitmore from the London Mining Network. So we're really grateful to them for being with us today. So a bit of housekeeping just to start off for everyone. This series has an associated code of conduct, and by participating in these discussions, we're all agreeing to this code of conduct. And you can find that pasted in the chat right now. Now, the aims of the Geoscience in Context series in general are to, quote, broaden departmental understanding of geoscience's place in society, the history of the subject, its modern practice, and its role in shaping the future. And arguably, at no time have the environmental and societal implications of geoscience research been more pressing than the present. So global warming, extreme biodiversity loss, widespread pollution, and deep social disparities are all the byproduct of a socioeconomic system that promotes consumerism, is fueled by the exploitation of natural resources, and has been, at least in part, enabled by geoscientific research. Over the next decade, I think we're all agreed there needs to be a green transition to a carbon neutral and sustainable system of living. However, there's a wider movement to ensure that the green transition also works to lift people out of poverty, stop human rights abuses, prevent further damage to the environment, repay those who have suffered due to extractivism, and make a more just and caring society. And this movement is often known as something like environmental justice. In this discussion, we're going to explore what a green transition might mean for extraction or the conservation, on the other hand, of natural resources, one of the key areas where the geosciences intersect with environmental justice. And before we get started with the discussion, we're going to hear some opening statements from both our panel members. So beforehand, I posed them some questions, which included things like, can extraction ever be sustainable? To what extent are technological developments key to sustainable extraction? And how can new ways of extracting and using natural resources promote social and environmental justice? So we're going to start off with Pippa. Pippa is the Director of Extractives and Development Infrastructure at Fauna and Flora International, which is a global conservation agency aimed at protecting wildlife and biodiversity. Pippa has extensive experience working across the private and public sector on sustainable development and conservation projects, including with hydrocarbon and mining companies. So we're delighted to have you here, Pippa, and I'm going to pass over to you now.
Thanks very much, Sam. I'm going to share my screen, so I have a presentation to offer this afternoon. Really good. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you today, and very much looking forward to the discussion after this. So really, I guess, you know, as geoscientists, or at least, or even if you're just affiliated with this whole geoscience community, it's really important for us to kind of look at the broader context and the broader perspective. So I'm going to focus on the full supply chain custody of raw materials and the fact that we all have a responsibility, from the mine to the smartphone and everything in between. So we've got, you know, we've read about the kind of huge demand that the transition to decarbonized energy will have on raw materials. And the World Bank and many others have released reports recently that talk about the continued need for mining, and that we have to ensure climate smart mining. And that's one of their sort of mantras. And the World Bank's most recent report, Minerals for Climate Action, finds that the production of minerals such as graphite and lithium and cobalt, things that we need in sort of e-batteries and that sort of thing, would increase by about 500% by 2050. And that's to meet the growing demand for clean energy technologies. And it's estimated that over 3 billion tons of minerals and metals will be needed to deploy wind, solar, and geothermal power, as well as the sort of storage batteries that are going to help us to achieve this kind of below 2-degree future. Now, while the growing demand for minerals and metals provides economic opportunities for resource-rich developing countries, and obviously a lot of private sector entities too, there are really significant challenges and impacts that will emerge if the climate-driven energy transition isn't managed responsibly and sustainably. In other words, the kind of clean energy transition will be significantly mineral intensive. So where are these minerals going to come from, and what will the impact of these minerals be? So FFI did a kind of great report in 2019, at least I think it's pretty good, on forest smart mining. And this demonstrated how significant the induced and indirect impacts of mining are on forest ecosystems. And there were a number of kind of big headlines that I wanted to share with you today. first of them is that large-scale mining in forests is a really big deal, and it represents nearly half of all large-scale mining going on in the world right now. And this kind of really is likely to impact about 30% of global forests. And to put that into perspective, this is really that there are about 1,600 mines that are happening in forests right now. That's 44% of all the operational mines currently. But there are about 1,800 plus more that are in development or currently non-operational. And the kind of key countries where these are happening are places like Brazil, the DRC, Zambia, Ghana, Zimbabwe, all really, really important for our forest carbon pools, but also really important socially, just in terms of understanding that they have a massive kind of social implication around economic development too. So using an assumed area of interest around a mine that might be, say, 50-kilometer radius around this, we can sort of estimate that the kind of footprint of these mines is actually enormous, and it could be up to 30% of forests could be impacted by these types of operations. Now, the second, and this is just looking at a 50K radius of a mine in Zambia. The next kind of key headline really is that mining in forests is really on the rise, initially in North America and Europe, but more recently in sub-Saharan Africa and East Asia. So demand for mining raw materials is clearly has a major role to play in the foreseeable future. And we've talked about this from the demand side coming in through the World Bank report, etc. But it's really true for a lot of this. But there's also a lot of investment happening in the sector in the kind of post-COVID recovery of the economy. So do we hold on to kind of the environmental and social systems and the governance that has been pushed really to try and maintain the standards or try and improve the standards of mining across the world, and that we don't start to discount social and environmental equity or standards because we want to kind of get our economies back up and running. So we have to understand that there is a lot to play for here. The third big headline really is that various examples of forest smart behavior have come through. And this isn't in a forest, this is the top of a mountain, but the same sort of things apply. And that there aren't really any forest smart mining companies out there. There are some that do things quite well. There's some governments that do things quite well, but there's a huge misalignment between what governments may think they're asking of companies, but also how companies are delivering. So we need to be much more careful and cognizant around who's accountable. So we developed, I think there are 14 principles that talk to this forest smart mining idea. But really, what we do, what a very clear principle, at least kind of has come out of this, is that there are obvious implications on mining in forest systems, on climate mitigation and resilience, not only on the carbon stocks, but also on the integrity of ecosystems that regulate and manage water and other key ecosystems which people are hugely dependent on. So there's also another kind of really interesting side of this whole mining equation on where resources are coming from. And this is really that there's this big interest in some quarters in developing deep sea mining and deep seabed mining. And that's primarily in our global commons, which is, you know, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but a lot of attention's been is being focused on the Pacific and the Indian and Atlantic Oceans, and a classic and very oversold story that's been evolving from these really hungry deep sea mining corporate developers, that minerals found in incredibly unique and vulnerable the depths of our oceans are really the answer to our whole climate woe. You know, that we can find these much easier and much less impactful than terrestrial mining. Well, the truth is that the impacts and risks to ocean health and the function of our ocean systems are really critical. And this is a highly impactful and very, very risky trajectory to start going down. So FFI produced a kind of substantial report last year around the risks and impacts of deep seabed mining. And fundamentally, minerals mined traditionally, and this is a key point for those of you, you geoscientists, is that minerals mined nowadays traditionally are derived from past biological environments, whilst deep seabed mining will entail mining living life forms that are responsible for creating and maintaining the conditions of life itself on this planet. So if we remove polymetallic nodules, for example, this is really likened to removing coral reef systems and the associated biodiversity to create cement. It's, you know, if we're taking metals from polymetallic nodules now, very much more complex biodiversity down there, very difficult, very complex sort of geochemistry, biogeochemistry going on. But we would be removing entire ecosystems involved in things like trace metal synthesis and regulation, carbon sequestration, and really messing around with the biological pump of the ocean. So the final point I want to make really is that what does this mean for all of us? And this is what I'd like you all to kind of start to think about is we're trying to do things responsibly and sustainably. You know, we have to go through due diligence on the entire supply chain of our raw materials. We've got to know where they come from, what the environmental and social impacts of each one is along its entire chain of custody, from mine to widget to solar panel to wind turbine blade, or whatever it is. And we need not only to know what their credentials are, we need to start recycling these materials. We need to build them with a circular economy in mind and not to compromise in any respect on this. So now the huge demand for resources requires huge innovation. But alongside that, a great deal of care and good governance, both voluntary and compliance. So we have to understand our socio-ecological environments and the socio-political ones. And we have to kind of understand them well enough for us to be responsible in their use. So that's it from me, Sam, for my opening statement. And over to you.
Brilliant. So thanks very much, Pippa. That was really insightful. So now we're going to move over to Andy. So Andy is a key member of the London Mining Network, which is an organisation that supports and advocates for communities around the world that have been detrimentally affected by UK-based mining companies. And most recently, Andy has authored the report A Material Transition, which assesses how the mineral demands of a green transition can be addressed through the ethical and just usage of natural resources. So Andy, I'm going to hand over to you for an opening statement.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sam. And thank you to you and the others for the invite here. Very excited to be able to have a discussion about this, precisely because, as you noted, I mean, my main role within London Mining Network at the moment is as facilitator of the working group on just transition and transition minerals, and also because of the recent reports I've written. And probably to give myself a break from slides, because I'm presenting the report quite a lot, I've decided just to respond to your nice kind of slightly different approach to Pippa's. I'm going to just respond to those 3 questions very quickly, because obviously, hopefully I can just make pointers that we can then discuss in greater depth later. Before answering the 3 questions, I just wanted to make one general point, which I think is pertinent to this debate, which is, I mean, we've used different words like green transition, energy transition. I mean, we're mainly focusing on the transition of fossil fuels. I think what our report argues, and as a key message that I kind of want to drive home whenever I have these discussions, is that it's not, we shouldn't see it in terms of just being an energy transition. What we're actually talking about is a transition that involves a huge amount of different minerals and materials. So I mean, that's why we talk about a materials transition within the report. So, you know, we've got to, although in theory, you know, the whole change will be less resource intensive because you're talking about resources that you're putting into, for instance, wind turbines or solar panels, which will last much longer. And you're not intensively continuing to dig the likes of fossil fuels. Still, you know, you are talking about materials that are required from them. So you need to look at it in this holistic fashion, really, to be able to understand and to make the right decisions. I think that includes for ideas like Green New Deals, where people are talking about, you know, ensuring that there are just jobs. For us, that means, you know, there's justice all the way down, and justice all the way down to communities where effectively you may have sacrifice zones that have been set up specifically to take some of the minerals to build these batteries, turbines, solar panels, etc. So on your first question, can extraction ever be sustainable? I mean, I think for me, it's good to go back to the Brundtland Commission and what they said. And I think the definition there is Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I think if you're taking that definition, then it's possible, it's difficult. When I think if you're expending on a finite resource now, then we really have to do it carefully, we have to do it cautiously, we have to make sure it's not just about spending everything in this generation and leaving problems for the future generations. And that's clearly what we're doing. So the move towards it being sustainable is difficult. I mean, I think for me, what's important is the Indigenous viewpoint. I mean, we've worked a lot in solidarity with Indigenous communities. And for them, you know, their whole ethos is that resources are finite, that you're there as a custodian or caretaker of your natural resources. And what you're trying to do is to leave them in as good a condition as you, if not better, than how you inherited them, so you can pass them on to your ancestors. So I would say by that definition, we're definitely failing, and by our current methods of how we want to switch to the energy transition, then we are probably failing as well. Then on the second question, what extent of technological development is key to sustainable extraction? So I guess in my experience, I guess I've got to give a very qualified answer that it's possible. Again, in my experience, it's really improved technology to me has meant over the last 20 or 30 years, primarily being able to extract lower concentrations of minerals from larger holes in the ground. So you're really talking about bigger and bigger holes that are being dug. I mean, we should have the technology to improve tailings dams, but at least until very recently, where there may be a change, but certainly in the last year or two, the amount of tailings dam failures hasn't decreased. So, you know, why is that technology not being put to the right use? I mean, it would seem to be because it's primarily over cost issues. You get, you know, the best costs, you get the best tailings dam you can for the amount of money you're going to put into it. So I think a lot of the same thinking may well go into technological developments. I think what could be positive, I mean, there are definite positive potential areas we could use for the energy transition. But for me, in some ways, that's more about assisting a circular society, which Pippa mentions there, and reducing the need for new extractions. It may not be so much about how extraction has improved at source, but about, you know, how we design goods to ensure they last, improvements in urban mining, which, you know, the idea of recycling, which mining companies could become involved in if they wanted to switch from primary extraction. I mean, there may be novel ways of extraction. I mean, certainly in the report, we looked briefly at the idea of phytomining, of you know, basically growing plants that extract minerals, in situ mining, where you're drawing leaching materials out, which, as long as that's done safely and in a, you know, more or less impactful way, could be good. But also, I think we've got to avoid sort of false solutions, which Pippa alluded to. I would say that idea of deep sea mining, moving into new extractive frontiers before you've even prepared the damage in terrestrial mining is, you know, just a complete false solution. And again, the last point on that is to go back to sort of Indigenous peoples once again, and they have an organisation which is opposed to the idea of geoengineering, which of course is another idea. My personal jury is a little bit out on geoengineering, but I think I can understand their point that basically these large-scale geoengineering projects to fix climate change, like seeding the skies or the seas, I mean, it's essentially fairly hubristic. You know, it maybe sets off completely new problems, and it seeks to use the same thinking that got us into the problem in the first place. And then finally, the last question on how can new ways of extracting and using natural resources promote social and environmental justice? I mean, I think in a way, the question here is more what's required for our relationship with natural resources to allow it to then promote social and environmental justice. And again, it's a little bit like the extraction side of it is almost, how does that fit into it then? So, I mean, the basic three conclusions or areas of our report which talks to this are, the first was about solidarity with impacted communities, local communities, so about supporting their rights to the free, prior, informed consent, or to ensure what was happening on their land, you know, that they had full voice in that. And that's going to be increasingly important in the global south and the sorts of places that Pippa mentioned, forest mining is going on, but you know, increasingly in even in Europe, where we're looking at new areas of extraction potentially opening up to satisfy demand. And the second was around supply chains. And again, I think Pippa finished beautifully on and said so much of what was required in terms of getting just supply chain and having the correct due diligence. But then that final part is really is on our consumption, which goes back to a circular economy. And I think more important than the circular economy, what we argue for in the report is this idea of a circular society. Because I think with a circular economy, it's still possible to have, to make everything as circular as possible, to have all of the materials used and reused and constantly looping back in. You could still be building more and more cars, bigger and bigger cars, ad infinitum. You'd still have an increasing circle. So to me, the idea of a circular society is much more about, the careful husbandry, the careful thinking as to what resources you use, what you use them for, questioning whether growth is necessary, etc. So obviously you'll have to go and read the report, and I'll try to drop into the chat window the link for those that haven't seen it. But clearly that's a sort of larger scale of thinking in a way. I think that sort of takes us, interestingly, even for us mining campaigners, it's a challenge to us to start going little beyond just the mine site and start thinking at a society level what we can all do. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.